Hello, can you hear me? Yes?
Welcome to our session on transforming global value chains for a healthy planet and prosperity for all. We're gathered alongside the United Nations Environment Assembly, and the World Economic Forum is delighted to co-host this session, together with the Swedish Ministry for the Environment, as well as the United Nations Environment Programme One Planet Network. I'm really excited to hear from our excellent panel, including voices from Walmart, Philips, Sweden, and startups. We want to make today's session as interactive as possible. Use the QR code coming up on your screens now to ask questions as we go. But why is today's conversation so important? Our speakers will talk about how we can make value chains more sustainable and circular. We're also going to focus on how Stockholm+50, a major global environment conference in June, can accelerate action. It's important to remember that local communities can be severely impacted by unsustainable value chains. For example, badly disposed e-waste can leak toxins into the water, soil, and even food systems, causing severe health impacts in young children. And many of us as consumers want to know that what we buy does not cause harm. The good news is that improving sustainability is among the top 3 objectives for companies in their supply chains. We're also seeing more and more action by governments to make trade sustainable and circular. To help us understand these issues, let me turn to Annika Strandhäll, Minister for Climate and the Environment of Sweden, for opening remarks. Minister, please, the floor is yours. Minister, I think you need to unmute.
Well, thank you very much for the introductory words. And let me first say that I'm very glad that we are having this side event here today, highlighting the importance of sustainable value chains as a contributor to a healthy planet. Many thanks to the World Economic Forum and One Planet Network for the collaboration, and welcome to all around the globe for joining us at this event. Distinguished delegates and colleagues, unsustainable consumption and production drive planetary health and equity crisis. Here again, the science is clear. The patterns of unsustainable consumption and production throughout much of the world are key drivers for the environmental and human crisis that we are currently face. People, planet, and prosperity are closely interlinked. The choices we make now will affect the future and, in turn, our own future prosperity as well. Still, we are currently degrading the ability of the nature environment to support human needs and livelihoods. Clearly, we can't continue on this path. We need a game changer, and we need a transformation towards a net zero, nature positive, and zero pollution. We need a transformation that leaves no one behind and that creates a healthy planet for the prosperity of all of us. In June this year, the world will come together in Stockholm to commemorate the first UN conference on the human environment. We believe Stockholm+50 provides a unique opportunity for progressive governments, business actors, youth, and other stakeholders to advance the sustainability agenda, bridging gaps between climate, biodiversity, economy, and the recovery from the pandemic. Stockholm+50 could be that transformative moment that contributes to a new understanding of how our economies, societies, a stable climate and resilient biosphere are inseparably interconnected. Business has a key role in realizing sustainable transformations, delivering a green and inclusive recovery, and climate, nature, and pollution goals. Sustainable value chains capture all that. However, companies cannot do this on their own. Policy, finance, and business must work together to create a whole of society solution. The sustainable transformation of global value chains must be our shared priority. We experience increasing interest from a variety of stakeholders in accelerating the sustainable transformation of global value chains to address the interconnectivity between climate, nature, and social equity. Stockholm+50 is a moment for global value chains to begin their transformation to net zero and nature positive. It's a moment for the nature positive and net zero agendas to be aligned. This is the kind of action-oriented outcome we envisage for Stockholm+50, with clear and concrete recommendations, charting the way forward and driving key actions for governments and other stakeholders to deliver on the 2030 agenda and beyond. An outcome that will mobilize the global community behind strengthened cooperation and accelerated innovative action. We aim to engage a wide variety of stakeholders that reflect the richness and diversity of voices and perspectives on the planet. We encourage all of you to contribute to the journey towards Stockholm+50 and its outcome with transformative actions for people and nature. The future is common. In community, we must share it. Together, we will create it. Let us start the journey here today. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Minister, for the very helpful framing of today's discussion. Let's turn now to our panelists. This is a group whose daily focus is on building sustainable value chains. We have Anki Bose, co-founder and chief executive officer of Zilingo, Robert Metzger, global head of sustainability at Royal Philips, Tom Smith, director, global government affairs at Walmart, and Deborah Nati, who's a research analyst at Footprints Africa. Ankiti, let me start with you. Zilingo is a cutting-edge technology platform for the fashion industry. What's the biggest environmental challenge in textile value chains?
That's a fantastic question. Textiles and fashion have historically been one of the biggest culprits in making the world less sustainable, contributing to climate change. It takes 4,000 liters, sometimes more, to make a pair of jeans, and 10% of global carbon emissions come from our industry. Little children in factories are making products. It's end-to-end, an industry that is mired with a lot of problems, besides, of course, the fact that we should look into how much people are consuming and then how much of that ends up in landfills and so on and so forth. So it's a very, it's a large industry. It's almost 3% of global GDP, employs hundreds of thousands of people. On an end-to-end basis, perhaps the challenges are threefold. One is in literally what is going into the product, which is the fabrics, and are they sustainable, because they're eventually going to end up in a landfill. Second is, what are the practices? How much water are we wasting? Are the labor practices okay? Essentially the production and the manufacturing, is it being done in a responsible manner? And then the third is there an aspect of circularity and responsibility in the way that it's being consumed? So it's definitely an industry that's mired with many problems across these three buckets. And of course, because of the nature of the work that we do at Zilingo, we believe that digitization eventually leads to transparency and more margins, which leads to businesses being able to solve these buckets of problems, not just because it's good for the climate or for the future generations, but also because it actually positively benefits the business, lowering costs and increasing revenues.
Thank you. That's very interesting, and I like your framing of the three very clear challenges, and we'll come back to you shortly on how we can solve those and the potential technology solutions. Robert, let me turn to you now. So Philips has committed to reducing CO2 emissions across its supply chain in line with a 1.5 degree scenario. But tell us a little bit more about the challenges that your suppliers face concretely in doing this, and how Philips intervenes to help them.
Yeah, thanks, Kimberly. Great question. The challenge, of course, is to the entire industry, right? Not just our suppliers. If you consider that the healthcare industry is emitting more CO2 than, for instance, all airlines on this planet or all shipping lines, then we understand that actually curing people can never go at the cost of the planet, so to say. And also considering that 3.5 billion people do not have access to healthcare, while already today the emissions and the environmental footprint of the healthcare industry is so enormous, we really understand that we need to do something to make healthcare not just accessible, but also sustainable in environmental sense. Having said that, a large part of this environmental footprint is in the supply chain of the healthcare providers, which means also in our supply chain. And that is exactly the reason why Philips became one of the first health technology companies to become operating carbon neutrally, but also to commit to science-based targets, 1.5 degrees. And that, of course, is something that we want to share and drive also in our supply chains and work with our suppliers. So not as a policeman of the supply chain, but more or less as a doctor, sharing the insights that we have, going beyond auditing, really trying to understand what the maturity level of the different suppliers is and starting to act together with them where they are today. And that really means also, for instance, sharing the knowledge that we have acquired, making capital accessible, bringing experts on the ground and really helping them to get them also to sign up to science-based targets. So last year we have committed to, by 2025, have at least 25% of our suppliers also being committed to science-based targets. And at the end of last year and the first wave of this engagement, we were already at 28%. I think the going will get tougher, but it's very encouraging to see that this is a topic that really lives. The impact of our supply chain is about a factor 10 bigger or magnitude, order of magnitude bigger than our own operations. And we really think that we need to engage with our suppliers to make the difference.
Excellent. Great to see that you're already at 28% of your suppliers submitted to those, committed to those science-based targets and aiming to get to 35. Hopefully we can continue to accelerate that action. Tom, let me turn to you. Given that Walmart is also a recognized leader in value chain sustainability, can you talk us through that journey over the past decade, so zooming out a little bit? And what has that come to mean for the company, and what are the lessons you've learned?
Yeah, thanks, Kimberly, and thanks, World Economic Forum, for this event. Some great talks so far. Look forward to the rest of it from the panel. So I guess I'm going to plagiarize a bit of a speech our CEO gave back in 2020, because I think this piece about this question about the journey is really important to us, and I think it really kind of helps other companies understand the journey that we've gone through to understand how they can project. So I guess firstly, we learned that as companies grow and mature, like we all do as individuals, our mindsets and perspective change. And one big period where the business made a shift was about 15 years ago, just above that now, when we made a significant commitment to the environment, to sustainability as a whole. It was a big inflection point for Walmart's history. So then, as is now, we're a big company, but not had fully understood what was meant to or was required of us socially and environmentally. As young companies often do, we were very focused on customers and associates. You know, we were doing some charitable giving and felt generally that we were doing good by serving others. We were also succeeding financially, but there was this disconnect with how we saw ourselves and how others saw us. So initially, the business thought that this was a communications problem. It obviously wasn't. And there was this wide acknowledgement across the business that we needed to change. I think the world had been expecting us to serve people, all people, much more broadly than we saw at the time. And so they were kind of pushing back. So there was a lot of listening to various stakeholders and associates, and inspiration had also come from the sort of emotional impact of our actions to serve others right after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. So the business stepped up. We committed our company to achieve, this was at that point, achieving 100% renewable energy, zero waste strategy, more sustainable supply chain, increasing the minimum wage. And I think really most people inside and outside the company thought the goals were unrealistic or financially questionable and not operationally possible, but they've been proven wrong. 2020 was also a key milestone. It's kind of fast forwarding a bit, was a key milestone for our sustainability journey as we committed to becoming a regenerative company, one dedicated to placing nature and humanity at the center of our business practices. So I could talk a lot more about this. I'm conscious of time. We've got loads more questions, but that's probably just a bit of an insight in how our journey's gone so far.
Indeed. Thanks for taking us through that journey. You work with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of suppliers. Correct me if I'm wrong. So tell us, what are the challenges of actually delivering on those goals? You mentioned it was a bit challenging, or there was some skepticism when you set them. So how are you going about implementing?
Yeah, we could talk a whole session on this. I think it's trying to understand how best we can use our size and scale for good. As you say, we're sourcing everything from everywhere, a whole bunch of different sort of challenges and opportunities. It's really understanding where best to focus our attentions. Where can we really make that impact and use the size and scale? And that's a challenge and an opportunity, I suppose. But that's probably the issue that we question ourselves and others every day, is to understand how best to target those efforts.
Great. We'll come back a little bit more to the solutions in a minute. Debs, let me turn to you. We've read your recent work, and Footprints Africa is doing some great efforts on supporting small businesses in adopting future-friendly practices, particularly around the circular economy. So in your view, how do sustainable value chains drive development opportunities, particularly for local firms?
Thank you, Kimberly. I think that when we started our work as Footprint Africa, our focus was that we were on a mission to prove that businesses can be a force for good, so that businesses were not being excused in our transition to what was sustainable and what was secular per se, because that's our focus. So we were using the B Core assessment, which is a global assessment, and then we later on added circular economy, where we wanted to support the transition to circular economy. We realized that, unfortunately, pardon me to say this, but the term sustainability has become kind of a buzzword and is kind of losing its weight. And so we wanted to define what sustainability means and how we wanted that to be implicated in whatever we did. And so our focus, our targets when we speak about circularity and when we speak about sustainability had to do with regeneration, and it had to do with inclusion. So we wanted things or businesses that were regenerative, the value chains that were regenerative, and value chains that were inclusive. And so when we talk about sustainability, then what does it mean in specific terms? So we are looking at paying living wage across the value chains. We are looking at zero waste emission across the value chain, which includes zero toxins, and it also includes less use of fertilizer, maybe not using fertilizer, thinking of soil health. We are thinking of local resources and community resources. How do we respect those things as businesses? And we are thinking of fair payment terms for the local value chains. We sometimes have the local and smaller businesses not being treated well because they are measured as bigger companies would be measured. And so those were things that we were thinking of when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about circularity in general in the value chains. Thank you.
Great. I really like that last reflection that local and smaller businesses were being measured up to the same standards, and that's a real challenge that we all need to think about how we address that. On this topic of challenges, tell us a little bit more about other challenges, or elaborate a little bit further on the challenges that are holding back small business circular strategies, particularly in Africa.
Thank you. So when we started the Circular Economy Project, we wanted to profile at least 500 case studies that were practicing circular economy, so we could understand what the circularity state of Africa was. We are going to publish that very soon. And speaking to some entrepreneurs, we had to interview some of them. We interviewed a little about 200 or a little over that. And we realized that they had some trending issues that cut across most of these companies. I can only highlight a few, but first one I'll talk about is how they had to take on so much in the value chains because they didn't have ready resources available for them, and they didn't have people to take on the different separate value chains. So instead of just focusing on producing one thing, they have to think about how the resources come about and where the resources come from before they could feed it into their production. And because they are small, they are not able to take on the pressure that comes with that. They also have to compete with bigger companies because these are usually small businesses, new concepts that are coming up, and they have MNCs that they have to compete against who are probably in the linear economy, and they already have all the policies and all the opportunities favoring them. So these businesses would have to build their customer base. They have to build, they have to do their own, give exposure, marketing to their products, and reach out to people, new people who would understand their concepts. And that also takes some time for people to get to know what you're doing, understand why you're doing it, and buy in. So that was also another challenge in there. And there were also power imbalances, especially when it comes to decision making and when it comes to policy making. So we would say that we are bringing stakeholders together to make a policy, but usually policies are far-fetched from what exactly is going on ground, because we are not speaking to the right people, the indigents. We are not speaking to those who are actually being affected by this policy or who need to implement these policies. And there's one thing I've been saying, that policies don't have to be thought of as separate things on their own. They have to be thought of as things that or rules that govern people, that these people are the same people that are setting up the policies. And so how do people set policies that work for people? And so when I am at the table to set a policy, then I'm thinking of how does it affect me as an individual and what's the implication on the environment. And so I'm not just taking myself out and trying to put up some set of rules and regulations. A friend, I'm not going to mention names, but a friend told me a story about how he was into reusable bags, producing reusable bags, so that they're advocating for not using plastics and single-use plastics. And they approached one of these big companies in the country so they could partner with them to use the reusable bags for shopping. And this company wouldn't want to buy in because they already had a foreign partner who was taking care of their plastic bags, and these plastic bags were supposed to be decomposable, and so they were just finding what they are doing. Solutions are supposed to be linked to the indigents. They are supposed to bring in the individuals on the ground, and we are supposed to be looking at how do we support the people we are serving, and not just trying to put something across because we feel it's going to support the environment or it's good for everyone. So I would hold it there. I'm not talking too much, but yeah.
Excellent, many thanks. Indeed, I think later on we'll start to talk a little bit about what policies are needed and how we really send those right market signals, both for the business that are trying to drive that change and also so that we ensure that we really have that meaningful impact. And Kitty, let me come back to you. Earlier, you talked us through the challenges in the textiles value chain. You mentioned issues around fabrics, you mentioned issues around production, and also creating more circularity. Talk us through some of the opportunities you see to address those challenges, and how can Zilingo help?
Absolutely, Kimberly. I think the main thing that is a reality is that the consumer wants something that's affordable and desirable, and unless and until we are able to help businesses make their products competitive, affordable, desirable in a way that's sustainable, it'll be very hard to drive a large-scale transformation, which means that business goals and sustainability goals have to go together. What we do in our work every day, which is sort of what we think sort of applies to the larger industry and many other supply chains as well, is that if you can use digitization to create end-to-end transparency, to digitize the flows of data, of goods, and of money, if you incentivize that digitization and that transparency, so as to give the businesses across the supply chain, like little factories and maybe mid-sized factories and fabric suppliers and traders, if you give them an incentive to digitize and be transparent, such as access to better financial services with that transparency, or access to better tracking because of those because of that digitization and that transparency, or access to better raw materials, access to better pricing, access to better markets to actually distribute their goods, then it starts to make sense. So just to sort of put numbers to that entire flow, right? In fashion, because in textiles, the whole industry is so undigitized at large that when you digitize it end to end from fabric or let's say from yarn to closet, you end up creating 15 to 25% more value, even fairly conservatively, right? Which means that you've opened up 15 to 25% margins for the businesses across the value chain. And that means that you've made it transparent, you've made it digital, you've made sure that the labor was fair, you've made sure that you've used the right, kind of materials as well. You've made sure that you can actually share those details, like, you know, how a food label is. Imagine if your clothing could have a label of what has actually gone inside it. And then you can plow those profits back to make sure that you can have sustainable practices. So I think it's important to use technology as a tool to drive profitability, business goals, and sustainability together, and then it works. So that's what we do.
Great. I very much like that, putting profitability at the service of sustainability. Let's dive in a little bit with you here. I'd love to get a really specific example. So imagine I'm a retailer and I'm looking to work with you to source sustainable fabrics. How would that work?
Typically, what retailers would do is they would have a design in mind, or they would have a specific, like clothing has spec sheets. It's called tech packs, like, which are the exact specifications of what your design needs to come out manufactured. What we would do is we would match a retailer or a brand with the right suppliers who can actually manufacture that product. They would sample that product. They would see what kind of ESG verifications the supplier has, and so on and so forth, labor verification, working conditions, and so on and so forth. At the factory end, which is the supplier, we actually have the software which is tracking every movement across the assembly line of that factory. And we are also selling or bringing in the fabric into that factory as well with our technology. So literally from the fabric business that's selling the fabric to the factory, then the factory is actually taking those raw materials, manufacturing the product, up until that retailer who placed the order. There's full traceability on a per piece basis, which is what sort of other industries like precision instruments and pharma, industrials, and electronics have had for a while, but was missing in textiles, which is why it was so inefficient and fairly unsustainable. And that's sort of creates this value.
Excellent. I really, again, emphasizing that you solved an inefficiency which is helpful from a cost perspective, but you're also then addressing the key sustainability challenges. So excellent.
Yeah.
Robert, let's turn to you for the buyer's perspective. Global companies have a lot of procurement power. So tell us a little bit more about how Philips is using that power to affect the transition to a more circular economy, which I know is a big priority for you.
Yeah, thanks. Happy to do that. And just wanted to applaud also Deborah and Ankiti for the wonderful examples that you have been sharing. So I fully recognize, of course, the enormous value creation potential for digital, and combining the two comments of you. I think it's not just about creating that value, but also making sure that the value is fairly attributed and distributed right over these supply chains. And that's, I think, exactly where, for instance, circular and more sustainable purchasing models can play a role. Now, we try to implement that also at Philips. I already spoke about knowledge sharing and capability capacity building. Supply chains and supply organizations of multinationals are very well-trained muscles. I'm sure that Tom can also refer to that, right? So, I mean, they have been trained over decades. The question is, how do you use these muscles? So if we also infuse in the target setting for our supply organizations goals like reducing the carbon emissions in line with science-based targets, or optimizing, let's say, and making more smart, for instance, circular purchasing agreements, or leveraging the capabilities of our suppliers to help us eco-design our products and lower the carbon footprint, we can achieve incredible things together with our suppliers. I think that's a different way of thinking. The same goes, of course, for our customers. So if you think about large healthcare providers in the world or governments, public procurement is an extremely important muscle that the world needs to learn to flex to push supplier preferences also towards more sustainable choices. What we do, for instance, is also linking the conditions under which you can access working capital, or working capital is being financed, to supplier sustainability performances, using things like CDP, supply chain ratings, and our own assessments, and increasingly also using circular metrics to really help our suppliers understand what our priorities are. I think a lot of things that we can do and that others can do, and also public procurement organizations can do, to signal to the global markets that we need to shift towards more sustainable models.
Excellent. I was really interested in that last piece on circular metrics. Can you tell us a little bit more about those, how those work, and how you use them with suppliers?
Yeah, happy to do that. And maybe we talk about it later also. We have been very active in really driving the transition to circular economic models because half of the global carbon emission reductions on the world need to come from this transition. You mentioned in your introduction, Kimberly, also that less than 10% of global materials are currently recycled. So there's a huge space that needs to be addressed. We are moving as Philips to offering integrated solutions rather than selling products. And of course, that is also something that goes upstream. Now, in order to drive that, you need to have also metrics. There's a lot of metrics out there that try to measure circularity. They differ by industry. But for instance, one metric is to measure which percentage of your total global revenues comes from circular models. So we try to go to 25% by 2025. And we have underlying definitions. That's something that we share with our suppliers. Then, of course, a more easy thing may be to say, okay, what percentage of recycled plastics are you using, for instance? Metals are largely recycled anyway. And signaling to your supply chains the amount in kilotons of plastics that you are willing to buy in terms of recycled materials, because that creates demand and demand security for your suppliers so that they can invest. So a lot of things that you can do. But of course, that's metrics is always an interesting topic. I think the most important thing here is to understand how we can increase the amount of circular models across the globe, regardless of the metric.
Absolutely. Indeed, metrics can be challenging given the diversity of them. They're so important. We need to measure what we treasure. But as you say, we also have to move forward in the interim. Tom, let me come over to you. As Robert mentioned, you're also a very large buyer in lots of areas, but you've particularly been doing some interesting work around carbon emissions in your suppliers over the last year or so. You've called this Project Gigaton. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks. And it's very much to this point that I was saying before about trying to kind of leverage the size and scale of Walmart for good. So, and Gigaton goes back to 2017, so a few more years before that. So I guess it works on the central kind of challenge that most emissions in the retail sector, which we were kind of hearing about before, lie in product supply chain scope 3 rather than in our kind of main stores and distribution centres, aka scope 1 and 2. So we launched Project Gigaton back in 2007 to engage suppliers, NGOs and other stakeholders to sort of challenge climate change. So Gigaton aims to avoid 1 billion metric tons, aka a gigaton, of greenhouse gases in the global value chains by 2030 by inviting suppliers to set targets and take action in 6 key areas. So energy use, product design and use, waste, packaging, deforestation and sustainable agriculture. So the very much objective is to sort of democratize climate actions by making resources available for any suppliers to get started and increase their ambitions and impact over time. So very much trying to capture and support all those suppliers in our supply chain, really understand and how to improve. We designed, or the team designed Gigaton, the actual specific Gigaton platform to support suppliers from a range of progress. So some that might be already in this journey, some that are starting up, very much just trying to offer resources such as calculators to help set and report goals, interactive workshops, guidance on best practices, and additional links to resources initiatives. And back to the point of collaboration, we're working with a number of different NGOs such as Wildlife Fund, Environmental Defence Fund, Carbon Disclosure Project to help us improve the methodologies, support supplier submissions on their progress, and lead many kind of initiatives of their own to support suppliers. So we've got, I'm trying to look at some of the kind of latest stats on it. We've got, I think it's about 3,100 suppliers already on the platform. And I think from last count, and this gets reported through our ESG report, what are we on? We're 186 million metric tons of CO2 in 2020. So we're kind of getting progress and really, I guess, a great example of how to collaborate with suppliers, actively giving people practical advice to help them on this journey to really galvanise change.
Indeed, yeah, a really good example, as you mentioned, that you provide those suppliers with the tools to be able to get to where they need to get, so helping them on calculations, best practices, etc. Really, really interesting and important, especially with that gigaton that we need to get to. Debs, let's come back to you. You talked a lot about challenges at the start, I'd love to hear if there's an example of a startup that you know that's offering circular solutions, particularly helping in the context in the value chain.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear what Robert and Tom has to say, and as Ankiti as well, like practical steps and tangible steps are being taken. And it's interesting to see, I'm excited that we have these big organizations taking these steps because, sorry, before I get to my response and the example, I wanted to make this comment that even though we are expecting businesses or small businesses to make these huge changes, it's going to be very huge and tangible if MNCs or existing large businesses are able to make these changes because they are affecting the impact greater portions of the globe or greater parts of the world. And so it's really going to make meaningful impact if they make their inputs and they make it tangible. And I'm excited to see that. I'll leave that and come back to that later. For the example, I'll speak about Meat Ecofeeds. They are an organization here in Ghana, and they're into production of that's maggots for animal feeding and compost for fertilizer for farmers. So Meat Ecofeeds actually started as meat when they were selling meat and food, that's food products, animal food products. Then they realized that the waste coming from their abattoir was very enormous and they didn't know what to do with the waste. And that was all going into the environment. And so they thought about it and tried to design out solutions that could design out the waste they were going to produce. And this was going to add up to the existing abattoir waste that was already enormous because meat is one of the things that is hugely consumed in Ghana. Let me speak to Ghana because I am speaking from Ghana. And so Meat Ecofeeds decided to produce these maggots and to produce these compost from the abattoir waste. Now, in doing that, they realized that, oh, okay, we cannot just use our waste to produce these things. And so they decided to reach out to the community and they started getting waste products from the community, the local breweries, and they started getting from the local porridge seller because they had organic waste. And so they tried to engage them and they decided to take all of this waste in to make their products. And now the product is being sold back to farmers for their farming processes, and farmers don't have to use this chemical waste, chemical fertilizers, which is already not so good for the environment. So farmers don't have to use that. And the feed is also used at their animal house to feed the animals for their abattoir. So this is them trying to close the loop and trying to involve the indigents and the local community to help do that. This example I would like to give.
Excellent. Indeed, I love the fact you mentioned closing the loop at the end there. Yeah. That's critical that we don't see waste as waste, but that we see it as a resource and an opportunity. And that's a really positive story from the context of the food value chain. Remembering, yes, of course, that agriculture accounts for 1/3 of global emissions. So really, yes, important to get solutions and reductions there in those value chains.
Yes.
Thank you all panelists. These were really great insights and a tour around the challenges and also some positive messages on the solutions. While you've been sharing, we've had some questions come in from the audience watching today, and hopefully the QR code can go up on our screens again for those of you watching in case you want to ask additional questions. But let me pose now some that have already come in. Ankiti, I'll start with you first. We've got one on technology, something you spoke about a bit. Now, the question is technology alone sufficient to address sustainable value chain challenges? Please.
Actually, I think technology is an enabler. Perhaps the other couple of things that play a big role is how consumers feel about it and how policymakers are going to guide us in all of this. So the consumer part is fairly obvious, I guess, but the policy part of it is getting more and more interesting. So technology along with strong policy and governance around this would really help. So for for example, there's a bill, it's not a law yet, there's a bill that's just been introduced in New York, which sort of the whole industry is looking at, because that means that the US in general would look at it, and therefore perhaps Europe would look at it, and other countries and so on, where any company that is retailing online or offline in the US with over $100 million of turnover has to expose very transparently at least 50% of their entire supply chain. Now, what that does is a couple of things. Firstly, it doesn't put pressure on small businesses or SMEs who might think, hey, okay, this is great, I want to be sustainable, but I don't know the first thing about doing this. And imagine coming out of a pandemic, I don't want to be penalized for not meeting certain requirements. So it does the right thing. It forces the bigger companies to do it first and sort of pave the way for how it has to be done. And along with that, I think what it does is it creates incentives for banks, financial institutions, certification agencies to all sort of work together with retailers quickly. So I think policy is the one thing that goes really well alongside with technology and consumer interest that can make this happen very fast. But obviously policy, not policy alone, but along with financial institutions supporting it as well. So it has to be a very concerted effort.
Indeed, and in the opening remarks we heard from the Minister that we need to blend the business practices with the policy action, and that's been a theme that's coming up again and again throughout this panel. So Robert, Tom, let's turn to you both. I think you might want to weigh in on the policy side. We have another question here, and the question is, are governments doing enough to deliver sustainable value chains? And if not, what more can they do? What types of policies are needed to build on what Ankiti just shared?
Do we want to go first, or?
Robert, please.
Yeah. You go for it, Robert.
So thanks, Ankiti. Great points. What I would maybe want to add, I think policies, so governments can set policies, of course. Government can engage in dialogue and formulate clear long-term visions also in terms of outcomes, not so much in instruments. I think that's important. And of course, governments are one of the biggest procurers in the world, which comes back to the earlier point that we made in terms of public procurement. We see quite a lot of governments really thinking about their long-term obligations to future generations also. I mean, climate change is just one of these things, but also actively engaging in social development and in driving the circularity agenda. There are quite some governments also engaged, for instance, in PACE, the platform to accelerate circular economy. So I think there are quite a lot of players that are really trying to develop that long-term focus and create conditions conducive to sustainable development, which is encouraging to see. But there can be happening more, I would say, on the public procurement and policy setting. So agree with Ankiti.
Great. Green procurement, an important topic. Tom, over to you. Your thoughts here.
Yeah, a big area of focus, and I think it's encouraging to see policies developing, and I think it has a real opportunity to level the playing field for a lot of companies that are doing good already in this space. I think some of the key points to be aware of, I think it's key to get policy coherence. You know, it's fabulous to see so many different pieces of legislation popping up in supply chains and domestic markets, but I think it's key to get them to all connect and synchronize. Otherwise, it then has this unintended consequences of making things much more complicated for suppliers. And, you know, these great comments so far today about SMEs, if they're having to comply with, 12 different pieces of legislation, it can get people tangled. And we said this before, policy legislation is one tool in the toolbox. We're increasingly seeing this sort of new buzzword around smart mix of complementary measures, national, international, mandatory, voluntary. I think it's this whole toolbox of things that isn't just legislation, isn't just going to kind of fix everything. It's a combination of all these different pieces. And I think the other point to be aware of that we've got to get this, this really careful balancing act is to make sure that the legislation is practical and doesn't have the unintended consequences of companies just removing sourcing from markets or from suppliers that are deemed too risky or aren't at the journey, at the sustainability journey yet. So just getting that careful balance is going to be a challenge, but it's the right thing to do. But I think that's just something for us to all be conscious of.
Indeed, getting the balance right is critical. Debs, I'd love to bring you in here because I know you mentioned the importance of policies earlier. So your thoughts, are governments doing enough to deliver sustainable value chains?
Thank you so much for the question, and thanks to Tom and Robert for the submissions. I really relate to the fact that, I think was it Robert who mentioned that government needs to provide that conducive environment. We have policies, first off, but I feel that most of these policies are fixed on, or they are focused on specific sectors. We have a lot of policies around plastic waste, and we need to think about the economy because these things are interconnected, and we cannot just focus on one thing and say that we are solving the situation. So just putting that out. And secondly, I see the government as the mediator, because if government does not provide that support for businesses, especially SMEs, then nothing is going to happen, because you already have the system that has been built to work for the linear economy, to work for wastage, to work for all what we are trying to avoid. And the system is already fixed. And if nothing changes, then if nothing happens, nothing is going to change. You're just going to be on that high streets going towards wherever. Maybe I wrote to distraction, not to use negative words. But I think government has to be that mediator and make it practical, these policies, not just some high-level, high-ended set of rules and regulations that we feel can solve the situation, but it's not actually being implemented on the ground because no one understands, no one is ready to implement what is put on there. So government has to be that, that mediator and provide incentives. I feel that we are given the wrong incentives, or we are incentivizing the wrong behavior. Our policies are incentivizing the wrong behavior, and we need to change that so that we are giving people the opportunity to transition to the circular economy, but we are making that fair and we are making it firm so that businesses who are already on the highway of linear economy or already not sustainable are thinking of how do we come to the other side, but they know that there are consequences from the government if they don't come. And those who are providing value on sustainability, those who are providing value, when you talk about circular economy, they are being provided incentives, tangible ones like tax reliefs, like governments. You mentioned, Robert mentioning that government is the biggest does the biggest procurement. And so are they engaging those that are trying to be innovative and those that are trying to bring in sustainable solutions, so that government is taking the lead to engage these people, and we are also going likewise, because if government does not trust these solutions that are coming up, then the ordinary or the private investor is not going to trust these people. So government needs to do these practical stuff, and we need to think of long-term investment. In the minister's speech, she spoke about how policy, finance, and businesses have to come together as one unit to support this transition to a sustainable value chain. And so what financial processes are we having right now? The finances that we are having supports quick incentives, like quick returns, and people are in a hurry to make returns so that they have to feed. For lack of better word, people have to feed. People need to make their profits. People need to pay back their loans, and so they are just on the high run. But how do we make long-term investments so that we know that we are going to get the impact in the future? And that is also needed. We should remember that things are interconnected, and so we can't focus on just one part. I think this is me ending out stop here, but these are some of the points I think we should think about and government needs to think about, and not just scratch the back of things. There is this saying that we say in the local, I don't know, it's just a local thing, that, and you can't say that your mother is alive. You can pretend your mother is alive even though she's dead. But then when it's time to go to eat and you are home, everybody goes home and there's no food for you, then you're going to accept that your mother is dead. And so this is us claiming that we are actually solving the situation. Government can make all the claims and do all the PRs and be out there saying that we are making solutions. But if nothing is actually happening, then we're going to go back home and we'll see the same challenges in our faces, and we would have to deal with it. So it's better we actually put in the work now. Out. Thanks.
Indeed, we have to see real policy change so that that enabling environment works for the business and the startups that are trying to shift within these value chains. You spoke a little bit about investment and access to capital. Robert, I wonder if we could come back to you. You mentioned that some of the work you do is around linking access to capital with circularity and sustainability standards. Could you talk us through a little bit on that front?
Yeah, happy to do so. And I just got inspired also by the nice saying from Deb. I think the other one that comes to mind that's often attributed as an African saying, I'm not sure whether it is right, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Yes.
So I think capital, of course, is one of the many means. We are talking about large-scale transformations here, not just of a company, but of industries or supply chains, right? So you need to have a couple of pieces in place. The first one is a story that binds people, a common narrative. I think climate change is one of these. Running out of resources is another one. Global injustice and social refugees is another one. So the pressure is mounting, but having that integral narrative, for instance, around the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations is important. Encouraging leaders, formal and informal leaders, to share that story and walk the talk, and building capabilities is another one. And then, of course, embedding in the system is the other one. So if our suppliers are all fired up and know what we want, and they have the capabilities to do so, and we punish them at the end of the year by not aligning our financial incentives with what they're doing, we are shooting in our foot, right? And we would be damaging these relationships. That's why I think it's so important to also align the financial structures, not just on the business model side, but also, for instance, working capital financing or internal long-term incentives and performance incentives with these sustainability goals. So that's exactly what we are working on with, for instance, giving better conditions, financing conditions, depending on supplier sustainability performance. So that's one of the many wins, but I want to stress that's part of the package that you need to transform large supply organizations or anything in the world.
Indeed, I think another theme that's coming up here is the need for many different levers across the value chain, but also from policy to be able to get to where we need to go. We have one last question that I'll ask to each of you in turn, coming in from our audience, and it's a tough one, so I'm preparing you. And it really goes to the core of the issue, which is, can we really address overconsumption within OECD economies to reduce their global impact on other parts of the world, and allow also then developing nations to have that opportunity to grow and develop? Ankiti, I'm afraid to put you in the hot seat, but please, let's start with you.
No worries, no worries. I guess, let me start with a statistic from our industry, which is, again, one that is driving a lot of that overconsumption, especially in OECD countries, and some specific countries actually do consume a lot more than others. Vis-a-vis 10 years ago, an average fashion consumer in a developed country buys 3 times more in terms of frequency, right? So not in terms of dollars, but let's say if I was buying 1 shirt every quarter, I'm going to buy 3 shirts now. And that's because of various factors. Many of them are social, societal, psychological. Social media has made the world an inferno of desire, right? So I see it, I want to buy it. There's not much you can do about it. It's not that we're spending money on making sure that it's sustainable or it's healthy for the environment or the supply chain or it's fair trade. So while we are saying a lot of these things, the statistics actually indicate in industries like fashion, especially fast fashion, people are just consuming a lot, and a lot more in terms of the number of times that they're buying it. So can we limit that consumption? Well, I think the jury is still out on that. Can we make it sustainable, responsible, such that it, A, is made responsibly, and B, the benefits of that consumption, that hyper-consumption in some economies, is passed back down thoroughly through the supply chain, right down to the person that actually made it, who may not actually be from that economy, because these supply chains tend to be very global? That is a definite yes. And definitely, policy, technology, interoperability of supply chains, all of the good things that we discussed here can play a role in that. But there is definitely merit in thinking about, can we consume lesser but higher quality or higher value? But I think the jury is out, at least as far as fashion is concerned, on that front.
Great, very interesting. Consuming less but higher quality, the jury being out. I like that. We'll have to reflect further, including after today's session. Robert, over to you. Overconsumption through value chains. Where do you stand?
Yeah, I love that question. I think it's a nested question also. I would say there is the element of reduction, and there's of course the element of global equity, right, and chances. And there seems to also be an applied dilemma between growth and sustainability. And of course, that cannot be a dilemma. It needs to be solved. I think Ankiti spoke very clearly about that also. So a couple of things come to mind. First of all, what is value and how do we define growth, right? I think we still talk very much about GDP, but of course everybody knows you cannot eat money. There is a decoupling also since the 1970s actually, that you saw that global happiness is not further increasing, while of course GDP continues to rise. So I think you see also an increasing number of politicians that start to talk about broader welfare, and they try to pitch these concepts. The same goes for companies. You see a lot of purpose-driven companies, including ourselves, that embrace impact metrics at the highest level. In the constitution of Philips, we say we want to improve the lives of 2.5 billion people. Now, making money is a very, very important boundary condition to be able to do that because we are stock listed, but it's not the primary goal of the company. So I think that is also an interesting shift that helps you to solve these type of dilemmas. I think it's really also about decoupling what we value from an increasing waste of resources. And here again, I think energy efficiency, resource efficiency, circular models are very, very important opportunities that we need to embrace, make sure that everybody on this earth has opportunities and can live a decent life without depleting the resources for future generations.
Great. So we had Ankiti on quality, and now we've raised the point on decoupling. Tom, your thoughts, please, on this dilemma and this question.
Yeah, great question and great points also made by the other panelists. I think probably the piece that I'll put in, because I agree with what's been said already, I think it's about educating customers as well and taking them on this journey. I think, as we've kind of mentioned a few times, you've got a whole wide range of customers at a different point in their own individual sustainability journey, and helping educate them into how they can be better consumers is, I think, really, really critical. And again, different markets, different products, people have a different understanding of exactly, how to do the right thing. And there's a tremendous opportunity of the business community to help bring customers along with that. I think the other point, sort of sub-point to that, is to understand what the barriers are. What are the barriers for customers in making those more sustainable choices? Understanding that, building it into product development, not just putting a certificate, it's not just as simple as putting a certification, but really understanding what the needs are in terms of the quality or the product design, all these different things, and building that into the whole product journey right from the start. And so back to this whole circular point is critical in helping address some of those kind of big challenges.
Absolutely. I was just thinking circular when you talked about the design element. That's really critical to help consumers actually make those circular shifts. So excellent points there. Debs, please, your thoughts here.
Thank you, and thanks for the inputs that have already been made. I particularly want to recognize with Tom's input on education and also identifying, what was that last point? But the last point was on identifying the barriers, yes. So that's very true. Before I make my points or I add them to it, I feel that education is needed. We need to educate people. Can we make it practical so that when people know that, okay, this is the implication of what you are doing or of overconsumption, they're not just hearing that this is the implication, but they're also hearing that you have to be responsible for whatever you're using, for how you're using it. And you need to pay for that. So there is a fee that someone is going to pay on the other side. And the fact that you're not seeing it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And so can we make people pay that fee upfront? An example is closing the loop. And they make customers pay a compensation fee when they get a new device, that is an IT device. Africa has been at the receiving end of most of these overconsumption behavior from most of these countries, sadly enough. And I think fashion, like Ankiti said, fashion has been one of the key areas, and IT or technology has also been another key areas. So to focus on these two. So how can we make people pay for these upfront so that they know that in as much as you're not seeing the implications, someone somewhere is being affected by it. So can you take that responsibility and make sure that whatever you're using does not affect the environment and someone else somewhere? So we can make people pay a compensation fee. Can we also block out the loops so that people feel that I can easily throw this after using it for a day or two, I can easily throw it this way and not think about it. And we have people throwing things out or over-consuming under the guise that, I'm using it for charity works or someone else needs it. You know that's not true, but you're just using it to satisfy your guilt. I don't know how this is coming out, but you know it's not true. You're using it to satisfy your guilt and you're still going on to reuse new stuff, which is being released into the environment, going to end up somewhere not being valuable. So why don't you make the right choices and not talk about some charity work somewhere? So people have to know and people have to be held responsible. And we need to block the loops. It's so easy to send these reusable stuff or first, what, can we call it secondhand? I don't know. It's easy to send these waste materials down to Africa because yeah, we need it. Okay, we know we need it, but we don't need all those secondhand stuff. And they come here and they end up in the trash. So how do we block it from coming here so that people who are producing it are taking care of their own mess and they are putting the right measures to take care of whatever they are creating? Because if it's in your face, let's say you are throwing out garbage into your back end and your back end is covered, so you don't see what's going on there. All right, let's bring that back in to your front view. Keep on throwing the waste and see if you are enjoying the view. If you enjoy the view, nice, let's go on. If you're not, you're going to do something about it. So people have to see and they have to make these solutions. Then I want to also talk about the barriers. That's also true because we can educate people all we want. We can tell people what's the best thing to do is, but if people don't have the right places that they need to use this educated, the knowledge they have, they don't have the right places to implement it, then they're going to just go back to what they know. For example, I know I have to recycle my plastics. How do I do it? I don't know where to do it, how to do it, how to get access to it. Then I'm not going to do it at all because it's tantamount to not having the knowledge at all. People want to use recyclables or they want to use biodegradable stuff, but if it's not accessible to them, if it is expensive and they don't know where to find it, then they'll just go back to doing what they already know. So how do we identify those barriers and build the solutions, making the solutions accessible to people, close to people, so they can come towards a solution and actually make these solutions work for them? Let me not talk too much.
Great, thank you. I really liked what you were just saying back then, that value chain sustainability does not mean dumping waste elsewhere where you can't see it. That's not actually solving the problem. And we've really then also got to get our trade frameworks right so that we cut down on illegal plastic and even electronics and other materials waste dumping, but then we incentivize the right types of trade for the recycling and for the alternative materials. So I think that's an area which governments and indeed in partnership with business and NGOs really need to think through on how we realign our trading systems for circularity to have the right impact. Thank you so much for answering those questions from our audience. I'm sure they appreciated all of your reflections. We'll go into a last round of questions for me. I'll start with you, Ankiti, again. And when you were speaking, you talked a lot about some of the policy developments that are ongoing, particularly in the US. But can I ask you to dive in a little bit deeper on what's been Zalingo's experience with value chain sustainability policies to date?
I think throughout our journey over the last 6-7 years that we've been in this industry, we've seen a huge shift in the mindset of both businesses, policymakers, and in the conversation that happens from, hey, is this an issue, to, yes, this is a really serious issue and we need to figure out how to actually get something done. I think Tom made this point earlier, is that, but everything's got to work together. though, right? So the data, the systems, the regulations, everything has to be interoperable. I can't have something coming in from China, then being, finished in India or Vietnam, and then finally getting shipped to Europe or to the US. And every country has its own piece of little legislation, but nothing actually talks to each other. So I would say that 5 or 6 years is a very short frame of time wherein at least the conversation has moved from, hey, is this a real problem, to yes, this is a real problem, let's invest a lot of dollars and mind space in it. And I guess now the challenge to solve is really how do we make it interoperable so that companies like us, startups, technology companies, we have a very clear path of how to execute. So I think that's where we are at in terms of what are the problems that we're trying to solve. And I keep using this word interoperable because on a day-to-day basis, it's great that there are legislations in different parts and different pieces. But a lot of the work of, hey, what does this mean? Does this mean I need to match a Vietnamese supplier to a brand in the US because their original Chinese supplier now cannot fit the bill any longer? There's a lot of lack of clarity there, which I think gets resolved only as we solve for operational smooth operations, right? So I think that's our experience right now, but we're very hopeful that it's going in the right direction.
Great, good to hear that it's going in the right direction there. Robert, coming to you, what's the role of government here, or how can you see government accelerating circular value chains?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Echoing also what Ankiti said, I think this interoperability is, of course, really important, which is not always in the hands of a single government, especially if you're operating globally as we do. But being open to the dialogue and listening, I think that's already a very important piece. Then secondly, what I wanted to say, of course, the challenges are enormous, but so is also the momentum, right? So I think there's a lot of good intentions, and now we know that good intentions are not always a guarantee for good outcomes. But I think governance can help to structure that. And I think both Ankiti and Tom earlier spoke about, for instance, policy harmonization. So not just between different departments within a government, but also interregional. So that's really important to understand, taking into account unintended consequences, really thinking stuff through end to end from a supply chain perspective. That really helps also. And coming back to the point, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I think really thinking about how to get sustainability criteria, including, for instance, circularity, into public procurement really will make a difference. It's a huge market, and the power of supply chains and also public procurement can really create these incentives and signal demand on the government side also.
Great, good to hear that message on public procurement repeated again. Tom, coming to you, and also taking a little bit of a look forward now, what are some of the policy developments that are on your radar in the area of value chain sustainability?
Yeah, David, great. A lot, probably. I think top level summary, there's a huge amount going on out there, as we've kind of alluded to before, and as all this conversation about policy coherence. I think probably some of the key trends that we're seeing is, obviously the main theme of it is moving from voluntary standards into these kind of formal pieces of legislation. I've seen the merging of the environmental and the social agenda. Great example of that was the latest draft of the European due diligence legislation, which that was released, day before yesterday, started many years ago on a human rights focus, and now is incorporating lots of elements on human rights. Likewise, the deforestation regulation in Europe has human rights elements. So I think that's a big thing to kind of watch and to understand how these pieces all come together. I think, so probably the three other kind of key trends is kind of one around ESG regulation. So not necessarily formally kind of government legislation, but just understanding how the investment community is operating. We're seeing that in the US and in the EU, that this is going to have this kind of knock-on effect on value chains, depending on how investors view criteria and how companies report. We're seeing the multilateral standards and policies from a kind of global level. We're obviously, we'll all be very familiar with what came out of COP26. We've got COP15 looking at nature this year. We've got UNEA 5 looking at plastics today. I mean, we heard about that earlier today. And we've got the UN draft treaty on business and human rights, as well as a variety of standards coming from the OECD. So you've got this kind of high-level global standards piece. And then thirdly, which is what we've been, I suppose, talking about a minute ago, got in this kind of country-specific legislation, seeing that across Europe and France, Switzerland, Germany, also in the US. And, we're seeing kind of similar pieces of legislation develop in many different countries as well. So probably that maybe some thoughts of some of the pieces we're following.
Three big trends there. If I can ask you a quick follow-up on that third level, the country legislation, to what extent are you seeing that those countries' policies are following the international guidelines that you mentioned on that second layer?
I think broadly speaking, they are. To what extent, I think, is probably the variation on that. And it's certainly a big thing that we encourage everyone to align with these central standards, which is where, the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights, the OECD due diligence guidelines, those are really kind of core pieces. I think they all refer up to them. I think to which degree it will vary, but obviously the key important point on all of these legislation is about implementation, which needs to be done in a local context. So there is slight variation there.
Indeed, it's and Debs, will come over to you, but you've mentioned this earlier in the panel. There's a difference between having a policy and then actually seeing it implemented on the ground. So Debs, for your last question here, for you, what really needs to change to help circular solutions kick off and really scale up, particularly in your region?
Thank you. With this, I think I'll start from us as Africans. So we are already aware, and this was confirmed when we started our research, that the concept of circular economy has never been new on this continent. It's something that we've practiced for long, but we're trying to transition, or rather leave that, because we felt, there was a better concept somewhere we needed to implement to look elite or to look high and mighty. Now we are gradually noticing that mistake, and we are coming back to where we started from. So right now, what we need to do is to make take tangible steps to implementing the circular economy principles. I'm excited to know that the WCEF is going to be held, 2022 is going to be held in Rwanda. So that gives that exposure, that puts the spotlight on the continent and on the country, so that we are able to explore what we can do as a country or as a continent to be able to transition to a circular economy. Then we can institutionalize it and make sure that we are making meaningful impacts instead of just talking about what solutions are supposed to be done. I think I cannot overemphasize the regeneration or regenerativeness and inclusivity, if that is the right word, of our solutions, because whatever solution that circular economy is trying to achieve is to make these projects or solutions regenerative and to include locals or indigenous as much as possible, because we are affected by whatever happens. And I'm not talking about just Africans, but wherever solution is going to be implemented, you should think about the locals, the indigenous, and how that solution affects them. And how do you bring them in so that we are thinking about building solutions that would work for them. So I can just chip in, this month in Ghana, we are celebrating the Ghana month. We want to celebrate things that we have as a country and how good they are. So when we are talking about solutions, this takes me to my next point, then we are supposed to build in solutions that tallies or works with existing systems, because we cannot say that, everything that you come and meet is wrong wherever you want to implement a new solution. You can't say that everything is wrong and you just want to bring in this new savior solution to come and help the system, but the system has things that are working. So how do you build in your solutions to match what already exists, so that people do not feel that this is a new thing that is being built, but people can just have that easy transition. It's going to be fair, it's going to be easy, and people can relate to it and actually want to implement it because they identify with it. And then who is at the table and who is making decisions? When you talk about the policies, who is at the table, who is talking, who is making decisions? That is very important, because if it affects me, I should be at the table. And I'm not talking about picking one person who probably can understand and speak English because, oh, this person is high to the group, but trying to be diverse as much as possible. The minister spoke about that, being diverse, reach out to diverse group of people, stakeholders, and get to understand what the implications of whatever solutions you want to introduce are, then bring their voices in and try to implement these solutions is very important. And we need to also support SMEs to capture value and not just capture it, but get value from whatever value they are creating so that they can see that, well, I'm doing this and I get this impact. And so I continue to do it. If I'm not motivated by what I'm doing, I'm going to stop because profits is one key aspect of doing business, of making solutions. Profit is one aspect, and we don't want to ignore that. So I think these are the points I would make. And yes, let's not forget that the locals or indigenous solutions are the best, and they can be the best when we are able to tweak in policies that work with them. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Debs. And you mentioned the World Circular Economy Forum that's indeed taking place in Rwanda later this year. I know we're really excited about that too, to be able to continue these conversations. Thanks to all our panelists for those reflections. I'm going to ask you one last question and also to check whether you've been listening to each other. Debs, let's start with you if that's all right. We'll go in reverse order here.
Okay.
So our question is, based on what you've heard from each other today, what would be the one message you'd want to convey to leaders when they gather in Stockholm +50 in June?
Thank you. I think I've enjoyed the last parts for this session, but I was thinking of what to say earlier, and then I thought about all the solutions that everyone spoke about and all the things that they said was happening. That was not, well, I wasn't the known about most of these things. And so I thought about transparency. There is a need to be transparent in whatever we are doing, and Ankiti spoke about it. So we need to make whatever solutions we are talking about very transparent so everybody knows about it. Then accountability. We need to be accountable for whatever we are doing. And we need, when we make it transparent, then people are going to hold us accountable. So I feel that accountability is also one aspect. And the last one is collaboration. We need to collaborate. Existing big companies need to collaborate with smaller businesses in their value chain. How do we make these collaborations tangible? And how do we make it open so that everyone can access it? It's very important. If we have these sets of rules that is preventing people from getting close, then we're not going to achieve anything. So I hope these few words actually say what should be done, but I'll go with collaboration, accountability, and transparency. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Debs. Tom, over to you. Based on what you've heard from the panel today, what would be your one key message?
Yeah, I mean, great question, and unfortunately, it'd be something that I brought up as well, but I know others agree with me. I think it's this piece about policy coherence. I think it's fantastic to see so many new collaborations, so many new actions, so many governments stepping up and engaging on this agenda, but we need to make sure all of these pieces fit together, otherwise there's the risk the movement will not be as effective as we want it to be. So I'll keep it nice and simple for that.
Indeed, a good key takeaway message on policy coherence. Robert, your thoughts on this, based on what you've heard from others, your one key message?
Yeah, I very much like what I heard today. I think one of the centerpieces that came back throughout all discussions is the element of circularity, right, that touches all of us. So if we could get our shoulders behind the idea of doubling circularity in the next decade, wherever we are, that involves all the elements, I think, including digitalization, including transparency, including harmonizing the policies around it, but embracing a vision like, can we double circularity as governments, as individual businesses in our supply chains? I think that would create a huge momentum. So I think that that would be my message.
Good. I like very much that ambition, indeed, to double circularity over the coming years. Ankiti, based on what you've heard, what would be your one key message?
I think all great points around circularity and policy, but maybe one thing that I learned and I was reflecting on is just on responsible incentivization. I think governments can incentivize, I think, there was a point that Robert had made about financing, Tom about different businesses across the supply chain working across different countries. Deborah talked about education. I think governments can do a good job of incentivizing people across the supply chain in different countries to achieve this goal. So maybe that would be a thought to end this with.
Excellent, thank you. So I think we heard some key messages from our panelists, including accountability, policy coherence, circularity, and ambition, particularly there, as well as incentives. So thank you indeed, panelists, for those thoughts. We now have an excellent closing speaker, Isabella Teixeira, who is the co-chair of the International Resources Panel. Isabella will guide us on how we go forward from today towards Stockholm+50 in June. Isabella, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. Good morning from Brazil. I'm very delighted to join you today. And yes, we have really excellent inputs in this debate and this dialogue. It's more than a debate, it's a close dialogue. And I'd like to thank you very much, the Minister Annika, and also the panelists, Tom, Robert, and Kit, and also Deborah. I think that the discussion today has shown that we can no longer think of value in purely economic terms. In reality, there are many forms of value, such as social and environmental ones. We need to understand value as a common good. It's something very important that should be observed, considering all the inputs that we have seen from green finance, like transparency, be fair, fair transition, etc. Other comments and really important inputs that we have during this dialogue. Green procurement, etc., etc. We need to change our mindset. Value chain demands value chain approach demands for narrative change and also to make transparent and the diversity of realities to manage sustainability, business, and green economic goals. You have a really diverse of situations, not only developed, but developing economies. And I think that Deborah makes very clear when she suggests, for example, that we need to deal with transparency, accountability, and collaboration. This is really diverse. Politically, is really we have a diversified world that we need to understand how value chain will come in this world and how indeed we manage business and people commitment and engagement. Supply chain, my opinion, it's very important that we observe the new relationship between nature and humanity will drive us to be planetary players, not only global ones. It's a new understanding. The triple environmental crisis, when you manage nature, we need to understand that we are interconnected and the impacts go beyond the countries or even the transboundary impacts. We need to understand how we impact into today nature and how value chain is coming exactly to make we have a better performance, but more than this, be committed and co-responsible. It's very important to understand the concept of co-responsibilities and connecting the dots, and also how we go beyond the short-term perspectives. As I think Deborah mentioned, the importance of long-term investment, but we need to deal with the short-term perspectives and the disputes of the past with the future. And I think that value chain has an important role to come into this new reality and to address concretely solutions and how we can act based on science, but more than this, committed in the right direction that some of you mentioned this. So I think that we need to learn how to grow with nature, not against nature. Okay, it's very important that you can have a transformative education to bring people back and committed to integrate to nature. It's really something that we need to understand how we mobilize middle class. Middle class in developed economies has one role, and developing emerging economies have another realities, and also poor people. Don't forget that we need to host and tackle social inequalities and value chain. When you have the decoupling of all the phases of value chains and understand better the relationship between natural resource efficiency and how we use nature, we need to understand how we indeed will improve our performance to deal with social inequalities. It's really something very important, even when we discuss sharing technologies, as some of you mentioned during the debate. So supply chain versus value chain, we have this debate here. I think that what I mentioned before, acting use science. This is what value chain means, okay? And also how to be committed to science-based targets, as some of you mentioned. And it's about global transformation based on natural resource efficiency and how connecting the dots, how we can connect the things, not play in silos as we used to play today. And moving from and beyond the green wishing, not greenwashing. It's green wishing. We need to understand our role, how we can convince consumers, people, our choice to move beyond and from green wishing, that everyone wants to act, consider the green world, but how can go beyond also. This is very important to be seen, to be observed when we discuss the value chains approach. The supply chain approach has proven useful to provide goods and services for consumers and users. It can address concerns of environmental impacts and exploitation of labor, okay, and for example, through product traceability and fair trade practice. The value chain approach builds on the knowledge of production process that the supply chain approach provides. So this is not about adding something new, but it was about connecting what already exists to address social and environmental change, local and social and environmental change efficiently. By applying a system lens, we can identify the socio-economic drivers and barriers, as some of you mentioned during the debate, that influence value chains operations of different sectors, taking account the complex feedback loops that influence the operations and the behaviors of actors along the value chains. It's not easy. It's not simple. All of you mentioned this. This approach shows that the key points of interventions are often not the same as where natural resource use and environmental impacts take place. That makes systems analysis essential. Finally, I'd like to remember here, because I don't have much time, I know this, to manage something that also was discussed here, stakeholder cooperation. This is not only individual players or some individual societies. We face a triple planetary crisis, as mentioned before, and climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution, and socioeconomic challenges. These are complex issues that cannot be addressed in isolation. Cooperation is key. So we need to know how we'll come. But it's not only based on the North and the South, the traditional North and South cooperation that we used to have in the past. We need to understand the new dynamics of the world that is coming into the global South, considering the Western and the Western international cooperation. It's very important to observe how these countries are looking forward to come to tackle, for example, climate change crisis. This is, for me, really important because we have countries like my one, Brazil, and also African countries like India, China, and other developing emerging economies, we have natural resource assets. You need to understand how we'll come into this agenda and how indeed we will address and be committed together with developed economies to change the world and to take the pace, for example, of international trade. Finally, we cannot forget the role, as I mentioned before, of middle class and poor people. Please don't forget it, because they are part of the equation. Local needs are also global ones. Don't forget it. Okay, if not, you need to understand how you come into this different reality. And when we have this approach to value chain, be sure we need to know more about how we can connect things and how we give back the good outcomes of this approach so people consider local needs to address local needs. A good example is what's happening in Amazon region in my country. What is happening in Amazon region is not the same that's happening in the northeast of the country or the southeast of the country. And we have 27 million people that live in Amazon in Brazil. Okay, and this 8% of these people live in cities. So sometimes when you go into value chains, you have this coupling process. You understand better how the things are connected. Of course, that will be committed. We need to be committed, but to be transparent. And we'll be dealing with fairness, we'll be with inclusion, and also need to deal with online and offline world. Take care of this, okay? Because it's not easy sometimes to manage short-term perspectives. How did we manage this? As all of you mentioned, that to be efficient, to be competitive, to have new business models of business, and also how you can be fair, how it can be inclusive, how indeed we can have a just transitions. All of you mentioned this in different perspectives. Even when you go into circular metrics or you go value chain metrics, it's important to understand the gap of data, for example, or how you can use science better to address local and regional demands. Finally, it's also important to engage actors at local level because there are different realities across the world and within countries. For Stockholm+50, I'd like to remember you that as we approach the summit, I want to underline that conversation on value is not about idealism. Please, okay, this is not idealism. It's about pragmatism. Okay, it's about putting values in action to bring about sustainable human development. Indeed, when pushing the issue of social inequalities, we're looking forward to address better human development in the new relationship between nature and humanity. In Stockholm+50, we'll see the launch of the Global Strategy for Sustainable Consumption and Production and Sustainable Development Goal 12. This strategy is based on the value chain approach and is aimed at promoting transformative and catalytic partnership across high-impact sectors and value chains. Of course, textile industries is one of the key ones. That's food supply chains, another one. It's very important. Mining also. We need to understand how the supply chains today will come to become value chains, as you have been discussing here. So I think that we are also taking concrete steps, in my opinion. Costa Rica's approach, for example, to food value chains, and new approach, and also Tunisia that is coming, addressing socio-economic concerns on primary production stage of food value chains, a good example that countries are looking to change modalities to perform in a different way. My plea to you is, if I can have this, Kimberly, please commit to the value chain approach. Engage those who have power and those who have not, okay? Expand the horizon of what value means. Put values in action and let us come together around a common agenda for a sustainable future. But don't forget it, the future is today. Bring the future to the present, take the right decisions today, and be prepared for a process of transformation that's not easy, but it's the right way. I'm fully convinced after almost 40 years working in this agenda that we need to do this now, not only because we have the triple environment requirements, but because we have opportunity to have a better life and to promote on new base, the human development around the world. Let's do it. And I do apologize because I don't have much time to discuss this, but look, we need to act using science. And value chains is really a good opportunity to connect things, to drive things together, and modern things, to use science to allow us to act based on our realities and our challenges and our ambitions. Thank you very much. Back to you, Kimberly.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Isabella, for those powerful closing thoughts. Thank you very much to our panel, and thank you to all of those that were watching with us today. We look forward to continuing the conversation through to Stockholm+50 in June. Thank you.